It might come as a surprise, but there is a thriving niche within academia dedicated to the study of historical video games. The scholars writing about this intersection of history and video games are usually historians or social scientists, and for most of the time, their main interest lies not in the assessment of the authenticity of individual aspects of a certain game, but rather in providing a general theoretical framework for where to place historical video games within the general historiographic discourse. Whilst we've occasionally chewed through these convoluted texts to be aware of concepts and categories concerning the methodologies of History in Bits videos, I've so far not directly discussed this theoretical groundwork in relation to our channel's concept. With this video, my approach will be different. When we decided to make a video about the authenticity of the historical strategy games' fan favourite, Age of Empires 2, we quickly realised that simply comparing the game to actual historical records would prove a lot more difficult than comparing our usual suspects, Crusader Kings 3 and other Paradox games. Anyone who has played 5 minutes of the game knows that the gameplay does not lend itself to historical parallels in the same way as our other content. So in this video, I'll first talk about how the game generally works and point to the problems the game mechanic causes for historical accuracy. Then I'll refer to and explain theoretical frameworks that actual historians suggest for reading games like the Age of Empires series. Finally, I'll put these frameworks into practice and I'll look at the individual campaigns in Age of Empires 2 and how accurate their storyline portrays history. If you want to hear more about history and historical video games, please consider liking, subscribing, and if you're in a position to do so, support us on Patreon. Speaking of which, a special thanks goes to our Patreon supporters you can see on screen now. Shout out to Dak in particular, who helped with this script and is a very active member in our Discord community. Before I assess its historical accuracy and explore how historians see the game, I want to take a quick look at the history of the franchise itself. The series was started with the first Age of Empires in 1997. This first game of the series was set in antiquity, allowing the player to play from the Stone Age to the Iron Age, geographically focusing on Asia, Africa, and Europe. After an expansion for the first game exploring the Roman Empire, the first proper sequel came in 1999 and was called Age of Empires 2, The Age of Kings. This was set in the Middle Ages, and although the subsequent Age of Empires 3 was also quite popular with its setting in the early modern period, Age of Empires 2 with its medieval theme was the most successful part in the Age of Empires franchise, leading to 2 reworked versions being released in the last decade, the HD edition in 2013 and the definitive edition in 2018. In fact, at the time of recording, the HD edition boasts a player count nearly 3 times over the player count of Bethesda's Starfield, giving an idea of the universal popularity of this game. Sorry, Todd. It is clear that the medieval theme is most popular with the fanbase, which is why I'll focus in this video on Age of Empires 2, and I'm playing it in the 2018 definitive edition, since I don't own an old enough PC to play the original. But it is interesting that the first 3 parts of the Age of Empires series span the classic periodization of history: antiquity, the Middle Ages, and modernity. This is something not unusual for successful series of historical strategy games, as Maria Hassemer points out in his study, Screening the Game, Screening the Play. Often, historical video games that make it into a series are connected chronologically, which we can see in Paradox games as well as in games like Assassin's Creed, but in Age of Empires it is especially striking considering its groundbreaking gameplay and concept. Speaking of gameplay, Age of Empires works very differently from the games I usually talk about, and compared to these other games like Civilization, Caesar or Crusader Kings, Age of Empires is rather easy to learn on a basic level. However, to master it is pretty difficult. This lies in the fact that it is a real-time strategy game, not turn-based, so especially in multiplayer, you must maximize your advantage by planning and acting, and clicking, fast. And if you've ever been destroyed on a multiplayer AoE game, you will know what I mean by to master. Really good players are just really quick at building up a massive army. So although Age of Empires is famously historically themed, its gameplay relies less on historical concepts, making all the different parts of the series pretty similar to play. As Hassemer elaborates on his aforementioned concept of chronological connectedness within the series, when writing about Age of Empires 2, he correctly points out that the most striking difference to Age of Empires consists in the semiotic system. Instead of temples with Ionic columns, the graphic now depicts churches with Gothic stained glass windows, timber framework houses instead of clay huts, a castle and knights instead of an academy and hoplites. Also, the monumentality is preserved. Though the Colossus of Rhodes lookalike of the Greek civilization in Age of Empires has changed to a cathedral vaguely in the shape of the Palace of Aix-la-Chapelle of the Britons in Age of Empires 2, and that connection within the games, making the gameplay concepts almost interchangeable, is what makes it more difficult to assess historically. Which is exactly why, for the next section, I've been digging up some discussions historians have had about the game. But before that, it is crucial to understand why actual historians even bother looking at games that are likely plain fiction to an overwhelming degree. And to understand this fascination some historians apparently share with us historically keen gamers, I wanted to quote directly from what Tobias Winnerling and Florian Kerschbaumer write in the book Early Modernity and Video Games. History is not about the past. It is distinctly about the present. It is about what the memories of events we think of as past mean to us now. Why we are interested, fascinated, enthralled or disappointed by them. And why we try to puzzle out a coherent picture from the scraps and leftovers of the past strewn around us. And as we are trying to do this, it is to video games that we now turn, because they are a rapidly growing part of the wide array of media that are meddling in this, our historians' business. They form pictures of the past and present them to their audience in a way that, judging by sales figures, condemnations of loving parents and defenders of high culture alike, as well as growing numbers of addicts, not only appeals to their audience, but reaches out far wider than academic history ever can. I couldn't have said it better, and this quote wholly summarizes what initially motivated the three of us who make up History in Bits to start this channel. The study of history has as much to do with the study of collective memory and discourse as it has with finding out what actually happened. And video games are simply a fascinating expression of that shared memory and historical discourse. That is not to say we shouldn't continue to assess the content presented in this form of media according to its historical accuracy. In the same book, Rolf Knorr writes in his chapter about the series' third installment, Age of Empires 3, that it is obvious that scarcely anybody or even anyone at all would raise the question of sound representation of history in respect to the narration of this game. According to Knorr, the game rather appears to be related to alternate history, science fiction, conspiracy theory, Karl May novels or similar, rather lurid formats that take a veil of historical fragments. Though the game is, although in a strange, comic-like way, imprinted by history. History is a kind of background noise upon which the actual narration and the mediality of the matter are established. Knorr goes on to ask whether Age of Empires can be seen as a source, which he first denies, but then concedes that Age of Empires could rather be seen as a source for cultural history of contemporary reflection on history. Another problem that many historians have with Age of Empires, as well as almost all other historical games, is historical teleology. Very roughly explained, this describes the assumption that history is following some sort of goal on a pre-described path. This is clearly apparent in Age of Empires, as the player has to follow a certain path of scientific and cultural progress, beginning in the Tribal Age, then to the Feudal Age and the Castle Age, and finishing in the Imperial Age. This is especially ludicrous given the series' gameplay, in which you essentially play only a single battle between, at times, vastly different civilizations. Finally, another angle from which to assess historical video games lies in the narrative structures the games provide. As Angelo Schwartz points out, this was one of the first characteristics in video games there was academic research into, but the scholars looking into this were mainly coming from literary studies, looking at how narration is arranged, compared to other forms of media. However, the historical narration within games like Age of Empires can say a lot about the present-day historical discourse about a certain period, which is why it is also important to look at the narration in video games from this perspective. And speaking of narration, I think we are finally ready to look at how Age of Empires tells stories and histories within its campaign modes. That way, we can get an understanding of what Schwartz means when she stresses the importance of an analysis of narration and narrative in historical video games. The historical narratives within Age of Empires 2 already start with the tutorial. There, you are learning about resources, buildings, and creating an army in the context of the First War of Scottish Independence. The game's intro states the following.
We are without a leader. The dead King of Scotland has no heir. War creeps in from the south, where Edward Longshanks, the avaricious King of England, has returned from successful campaigns in Wales and France. As Longshanks turns his attention to Scotland, the shadow of fear settles across the Highlands. The English have thousands of Welsh longbowmen, hundreds of knights on horseback, and dozens of siege weapons. We Scottish have a rabble of untrained soldiers who do not even know how to march in a straight line. We must act soon. If we are to have any chance of resistance, we need to forge an army by any means necessary.
Shout out to my mate the Love Rod for lending me his voice for this excerpt. This is already quite a sloppy depiction, as the last monarch ruling over Scotland before Edward Longshanks invaded was not actually a king, but a little girl. In particular, it was the old Scottish king's granddaughter, Margaret, Maid of Norway. When her predecessor, King Alexander III, died, Margaret was just 3 years old, and she was staying in Bergen, Norway, as she was the daughter of a princess of Scotland and her husband, King Eric II of Norway. She was an unlikely heir, and only inherited Scotland because she was literally the last of Alexander III's descendants. Her mother had died, her uncle had died, and so had all the other relatives. Margaret was finally brought to Scotland as a 7-year-old, but during the journey she also died on the island of Orkney, off the coast of mainland Scotland, presumably from food poisoning. Whilst it's cool to use the famous story of Edward Longshanks and William Wallace, it speaks volumes that Margaret is completely left out here. It is truly a fascinating story of a little girl abroad suddenly becoming Queen of Scotland, but it does not fit with the game's focus on combat and strength. In reality, it was only after Margaret's death that the Scottish crown became threatened by Edward I. Edward was initially invited by the Scottish nobility to act as arbitrator after she died. However, he completely overstepped his authority and mistreated the new Scottish king, John Balliol, finally invading Scotland in 1296, 10 years after the old King of Scotland actually died. Another popular campaign within Age of Empires 2 follows a story we actually already covered in an earlier video in our series about Crusader Kings. We are talking, of course, about the story of the Jimenez brothers and their fight over the Christian kingdoms in northern Spain. In this campaign, you play as El Cid, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, a famous Spanish knight of the 11th century. You start as one of the most skilled warriors in the army of King Sancho of Castile. And at the very beginning, King Sancho gives you a horse to participate as a champion against another knight of his army. That horse gets called Babieca by Sancho, and this was actually the name of El Cid's legendary horse, although legends tell a different story of how he achieved it. In the first mission, you have to win the Battle of Golpellera for King Sancho. This is actually the battle where the Castilian forces defeated the Leonese under Sancho's brother, Alfonso. To win this mission, it does not suffice to march against Alfonso and his Leonese forces solely with the army Sancho has given you. Instead, you will have to build up an additional army to defeat the Leonese army in their castle. As far as I can tell, the story thus far is fairly accurate. According to historical records, Sancho's initial attack against Alfonso at Golpellera was unsuccessful, and only after El Cid took control and encouraged the troops did they defeat Alfonso. However, at the end of this first mission, the problems start. The story of the game goes that after the battle, Alfonso and Sancho held an audience under the city walls of Zamora, during which Alfonso poisoned Sancho. This is inaccurate, since after the Battle of Colpellera, Alfonso actually went into exile in Toledo, and it was another Leonese nobleman who killed Sancho, a story we cover in more detail in our CK3 video on northern Spain. Furthermore, another strong woman and ally of Alfonso was left out here, his sister Urraca. Anyway, from there it continues to be problematic. In the second mission there is some kind of civil war in Toledo, in which a combined force of Spanish and Muslim rebels has kicked out the Imam, who you were supposed to help by collecting certain relics and bringing them to his island in the lake. First of all, I've been to Toledo, and there is no lake. Also, Alfonso and his kingdom were at first allied to the old Muslim king of Toledo, Al-Manun, and did use a rebellion against the grandson of Al-Manun, Al-Qadir, to besiege the city and conquer it in 1085. So there was a rebellion, but it happened very differently to how the game portrays it. In the third mission, El Cid gets exiled by Alfonso, after which he suddenly speaks Arabic, as the in-game civilization he is portrayed to changes to the Saracens. While the change of culture and language is obviously ridiculous, his exile actually happened, and he did then fight for Muslim rulers as well. There is debate among historians why Rodrigo Diaz was exiled. Some speculate that it was because El Cid attacked Al-Qadir, who was at that point still only a vassal of Alfonso, so before Castile besieged Toledo, which in the game happens in Mission 2, as we discussed. In sum, the whole timeline of this campaign in Age of Empires just does not make any sense, and is loosely based on historical facts at best. But maybe that is the whole point of Age of Empires. When discussing the idea for this video with our fans on Discord, one of our patrons, Dak, has pointed us to a 2018 article describing the early stages of development of Age of Empires, in which Richard Moss of Ars Technica interviews several of the key people involved in the first game's creation. Apparently, from the beginning they aimed for what they describe in the article as Hollywood history, consciously avoiding historical accuracy. According to the article, history's real value from a gameplay perspective was as a shorthand to help players learn the rules. For that, accuracy was irrelevant. As long as Age of Empires seemed historically authentic, it would be accessible to a much larger and more diverse audience than the dozens of fantasy and science fiction RTS games in development at the time. They go on to quote Age of Empires programmer Matt Pritchard, explaining that, "If you look at a sci-fi RTS, you might not be able to tell, why is this better than that unit? But when you see, in our game, a guy carrying a big club meeting up with a guy in armour riding on top of an elephant, you have a pretty good idea who's going to come out on the bottom of that encounter." So the historical theme works to enrich the gameplay, but it does not convey actual history, and it openly acknowledges that. Nevertheless, we'd be happy to cover more campaigns within Age of Empires, so tell us which ones you'd be interested in. Or if you have any other ideas on videos about this or similar games, let us know in the comments as well. If this sort of video interests you, please like and subscribe to our channel to appease the almighty algorithm. Finally, we want to thank our audience, our patrons, the Love Rod, and our Discord community, especially Dak, who actively helped us in the research process for this video this time. See you next time for more history in bits.